The dust had not yet settled when Abel McCrae turned his back on the body of Clyde Fenton and looked straight at her. Not at the crowd that pressed against the wooden storefronts of Redemption, Texas. Not at the sheriff who stood frozen with his hand still resting on a holster he had never drawn. Not at the three other men who had come to watch Clyde Fenton end the gunfighter who had ridden into their town without invitation. Abel McCrae looked straight at Harriet Baker. His gray eyes found her through the smoke, through the chaos, through the noise of women screaming and horses rearing against their hitching posts. He found her the way a compass needle finds north, with an inevitability that made the watching crowd go silent in confused curiosity, because this man who had just put a bullet through Clyde Fenton's shooting hand and then, when Fenton reached for his second iron, put another one through his chest, was standing in the middle of the street bleeding from a cut above his brow and looking at a woman who had nothing to do with any of it. Or so the crowd believed. Harriet did not move. She stood on the boardwalk outside Cassidy's general store with a paper-wrapped parcel of flour pressed against her chest, and her dark hair falling loose from its pins, and her brown eyes wide as creek water after a storm. She was 24 years old, and she had spent every one of those years learning how to make herself invisible, and it had not worked today, not with this man, not with these eyes that were tracking across the distance between them like he was reading something written on her face that no one else could see. Abel took one step toward her, then another. The crowd parted without him asking. Men who had faced down outlaws and droughts and Apache raids stepped aside for this lean, dark-haired gunfighter with blood on his face and a still-smoking Colt in his right hand. And they did it without thinking because the look on his face made it very clear that he was going somewhere, and nothing on earth was going to stop him. He stopped at the edge of the boardwalk, 3 feet from Harriet Baker, and he looked up at her, and he said the words that she would hear in her memory for the rest of her life. "What's your name?" Not "who are you?" Not "are you all right?" Not the dozen other things a reasonable man might say after killing someone in the middle of the street. "What's your name?" Because he had asked her that question before the fight. He had looked across the crowded street before he ever said a word to Clyde Fenton, and he had looked at Harriet, and something in his expression had shifted in a way she could not understand, and he had asked a man standing near her, quietly, almost to himself, "Who is that woman?" And the man had said he did not know her name, and Abel McCrae had filed that information away like unfinished business. And now Clyde Fenton was dead, and the gunfighter was standing, and the first thing he did was come back for the answer to the question he had not gotten to finish asking. "Harriet," she said. Her voice barely cleared the distance between them. "Harriet Baker." Something moved across his face, not surprise, not relief, something older and quieter than either of those things, something that looked frighteningly close to recognition, like he had heard that name in a dream and was only now meeting the person who belonged to it. "Abel McCrae," he said. And the story of how they arrived at this impossible, blood-soaked, dust-drenched moment was long and complicated and full of the kinds of secrets that the Wild West kept buried under its beautiful, merciless landscape. And it had started 6 weeks earlier, in a different town, with a different kind of violence entirely. It had started with a letter. Harriet Baker had received it on a Tuesday morning in the town of Graves Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1882. She was working the front counter of her father's dry goods store, tallying columns of credit owed by the surrounding ranches, when the postal rider came through the door with a packet of mail and dropped 3 envelopes in front of her. 2 were bills. 1 was a letter with no return address written in a hand she did not recognize. She had opened it and read it twice before she understood what it was saying. The letter informed her, in polite and businesslike language, that her father, Thomas Baker, had accumulated a debt of $3,000 to a man named Harlan Fenton, who operated a land and cattle operation out of Redemption, Texas, and that this debt was secured against the Baker family store and the land it sat on, and that the terms had been called in, and that Harriet's father had 60 days to either pay in full or surrender the property. Thomas Baker was not in Graves Creek to read that letter. Thomas Baker had been dead for 11 months. Harriet had sat down on the stool behind the counter and read the letter a third time, and then a fourth time, and then she had put it in her apron pocket and gone back to her columns of numbers. Because she was a practical woman, and she had learned very early in her life that panic was a luxury she could not afford. Her mother had died when Harriet was 9, of typhoid fever that swept through Graves Creek in the summer of 1867. Her father had raised her and her younger brother, Daniel, alone, and he had been a good man, a hard-working man, a man who loved books and hated injustice and taught his children both. He had also been a man with a talent for misfortune, for trusting the wrong people with the wrong amounts of money at the wrong times, and his death the previous spring had left Harriet with a store, a brother who was studying law in Santa Fe, and more debts than she had initially known about. The letter from Harlan Fenton was the worst of them, because it was also a trap. Harriet understood that by the time she had read it a fifth time, 60 days to pay $3,000 was not a real offer. A woman running a dry goods store in a small New Mexico town in 1882 could not produce $3,000 in 60 days. The math was impossible, and whoever had written that letter knew it. The point was not to give her a chance to pay. The point was to put the building blocks of a legal seizure in place, and to do it with enough formality that anyone who questioned it afterward would find the paperwork in perfect order. She had written back immediately, asking for documentation of the original loan, proof that her father had signed any such agreement, and a full accounting of the terms. She had received no reply for 3 weeks. Then a man had arrived at the store. He was not Harlan Fenton. He was a younger man, wide-shouldered and narrow-eyed, who introduced himself as Clyde Fenton, Harlan's son, and who looked around the store with the proprietary satisfaction of a man who had already decided the place belonged to him. He had been pleasant in the way that people are pleasant when they are holding all the cards and they want you to know it. He had told her the documentation was in order and that he would be happy to discuss the debt. And then his eyes had moved over her in a way that made the small hairs on the back of her neck stand up, and he had suggested that there might be other ways to settle the matter that did not involve money. Harriet had told him to get out of her store. He had laughed and told her she would change her mind. He had come back twice after that, and each time the pleasant manner had slipped a little further, and each time the implied threat had become a little more explicit, and each time Harriet had told him to leave and he had gone, but the going felt less like respect and more like patience. The Fenton family was not in a hurry. They had the legal document. They had the 60-day clock. They could afford to wait. It was Harriet who could not afford to wait. She had written to her brother Daniel, who was still studying law and could not come immediately, and he had written back with advice and the names of 2 lawyers in Santa Fe who might be willing to take the case on credit. She had also written to every banking institution within reasonable distance asking about the possibility of a loan, and she had received 3 polite rejections. Then she had found something in her father's papers. It was a bill of sale, handwritten on the back of a supply invoice, dated 3 years earlier, documenting the transfer of 20 head of longhorn cattle from Thomas Baker to a man named Harlan Fenton in partial satisfaction of what the document described as a friendly loan of $800. 20 head of longhorn cattle in 1879 would have been worth more than $800 at market price. The math did not add up in her father's favor, and the fact that her father had signed the document suggested he had been in the kind of desperate situation where men sign things they should not sign. But it also told her that the debt her father had taken on in the first place was $800, not $3,000, and somewhere between 1879 and the letter she had received in April of 1882, that number had more than tripled. She had packed a bag, locked the store, and taken the twice-weekly stage to Redemption, Texas. She intended to find out where the rest of that money had come from, and she intended to find someone who could help her prove the difference. She had not expected to find Abel McCrae. Abel McCrae had been many things in his 30 years on Earth. He had been a ranch hand in Colorado. He had been a scout for the Army out of Fort Stockton. He had been a deputy marshal in a town that had rather quickly decided they preferred someone who enforced the law with less uncomfortable thoroughness. He had been, for 3 years in the mid-1870s, a professional gambler working the saloons between Abilene and Dodge City. And he had been, for the last 4 years, something that did not have a clean name. He was not a bounty hunter exactly, though he had brought men in for the reward money when the work required it. He was not a hired gun exactly, though he had accepted money to solve problems that required a certain kind of direct intervention. He existed in that particular gray zone that the frontier produced with reliable frequency, the space between the law and the lawless where men who were willing to operate without the comfort of clear categories could find steady employment. He had arrived in Redemption, Texas, not because of Harriet Baker, but because of a man named Webb Lattimore. Webb Lattimore was a former Confederate soldier who had spent the years since the war accumulating grievances, and a small, loyal company of men who shared them. He had been drifting through 3 counties for the past 18 months, robbing stages and small payrolls, and generally making himself into the kind of problem that the local law enforcement was either unable or unwilling to address. The Cattlemen's Association of Cutler County had quietly pooled $200 in reward money and sent word through the channels that men like Abel McCrae monitored, and Abel had come. He had been in Redemption for 4 days when Harriet Baker stepped off the stage. He noticed her immediately, not in the sharp and pointed way that a man notices a beautiful woman with intent, but in the careful and practiced way that a man who has survived this long in a dangerous profession notices anything that does not fit the expected pattern of a place. Redemption was a cattle town. It was rough and practical and almost entirely utilitarian in the way that cattle towns were in 1882. Its permanent female population consisted largely of the wives of merchants and ranchers, the women who worked in the 2 saloons, and the Mexican and mixed-race women who did domestic work for the wealthier households. They were all of them women who belonged to the place, women who moved through it with the ease of long familiarity. Harriet Baker did not move through Redemption with any kind of ease. She moved through it with the careful, controlled caution of someone walking across ground she suspects might give way under her feet. She carried a leather satchel in one hand and a determined expression that seemed to cost her considerable effort to maintain, and she went directly to the hotel without looking right or left, which was itself a kind of telling. Abel had watched her from a chair on the porch of the Redemption Saloon and thought, that woman is in trouble. Then he had gone back to thinking about Webb Lattimore, because that was what he was being paid for. The trouble found him anyway. It found him on his 2nd day in Redemption, when he was sitting in the hotel dining room eating a late breakfast, and he heard, from the front desk, the clipped, controlled voice of a woman asking for the name of the county land registrar, and the desk clerk responding with the particular kind of unhelpfulness that men in small frontier towns sometimes deployed toward women who were asking questions they should not, in the clerk's private judgment, be asking. Abel had looked up from his eggs and seen Harriet Baker standing at the front desk with her leather satchel open and a document in her hand, and an expression on her face that was caught between frustration and a very careful, very disciplined suppression of fear. He had recognized that expression. He had seen it on people standing at the edge of the kind of situation where things could go very badly very fast, and he had seen it on people who knew enough about where they were standing to be afraid, but were choosing not to show it. And the combination of those 2 things in that particular face had made him set down his fork and pay close attention. The clerk had eventually told her that the land registrar's office was on Pico Street, 2 blocks east, and that it was only open Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and that since today was Wednesday, she would have to wait until tomorrow. He had delivered this information with an air of satisfaction that suggested he found the inconvenience more enjoyable than he should have. Harriet had thanked him, repacked her satchel, and gone back upstairs. Abel had finished his breakfast and then done something that he later recognized as the first step in a direction he could not have predicted, and would not have chosen if he had known where it was leading, and would not have changed for anything in the world once he arrived at the end of it. He had asked the desk clerk about her, not who she was. The clerk clearly did not know that. He had asked very casually whether she was a new resident or passing through, and the clerk had said she had come in on the Tuesday stage and had asked a lot of questions about the Fenton family land holdings, and that she was probably one of those people who thought she had some kind of grievance against the Fentons, and that those people generally left town quite quickly once they understood the situation. Abel had said, "What situation is that?" The clerk had said, "The Fentons own half this county." Abel had gone for a walk after that, and the walk had taken him past the land registrar's office, which was indeed closed, and past Harlan Fenton's cattle operation, which occupied a large and prosperous-looking property on the north end of town, and past the law office of Redemption's sheriff, a man named Dooley who had the look of someone whose professional judgments were substantially influenced by which direction the money was coming from. By the time he returned to the hotel, Abel McCrae had a fairly clear picture of what kind of town Redemption was, and it was the kind of town where a woman alone with a document and a grievance against the wealthiest family in the county was in a very precarious position. He had not yet spoken to her. He would not speak to her until the next morning. The land registrar's office opened at 8 in the morning on Thursdays, and when Abel arrived at 5 minutes past 8, Harriet Baker was already there. She was standing at the counter with her documents spread out before her, and a small, serious man with wire-rimmed spectacles was looking at them, with the kind of careful neutrality that suggested he was trying very hard not to have any visible reaction. Abel had taken a seat near the door and opened a week-old newspaper and begun to read, which was to say he began to watch Harriet Baker, having the conversation she had come to Redemption to have, while appearing to read a newspaper. The registrar's name was Mr. Ellison, and he was a more honest man than his surroundings perhaps encouraged, because after examining the documents for several minutes in silence, he told Harriet that the debt instrument filed with his office did indeed reflect a figure of $3,000, and that it was dated 1880, not 1879, as the earlier bill of sale suggested, and that it bore Thomas Baker's signature, and that the signature appeared consistent with the one on the property registration for the Graves Creek store. Harriet had asked whether there was any record of how the original $800 loan had grown to $3,000 in the space of 1 year. Ellison had said there was no such record in his office. Harriet had asked whether there were any other instruments, any other documents, any other record of transactions between Thomas Baker and Harlan Fenton. Ellison had hesitated, and in that hesitation Abel had seen the shape of the hidden thing, the thing that the registrar knew but was not sure he should say. Harriet had seen it too. She was, Abel would learn, extraordinarily perceptive. She had said, quietly and with great precision, "Mr. Ellison, I am not here to cause trouble for your office or for anyone in this town. I am here because my father is dead and I believe he was cheated, and all I am asking you for is the factual record of what is filed in this county." Ellison had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had gone into the back room and come out with a second ledger, and he had shown her an entry that indicated that in 1880, a note of $3,000 had been recorded against the Baker property, replacing an earlier note of $800, with the difference attributed to accumulated interest and penalties. An annual interest rate of 270%. Harriet had said nothing for a long moment. Then she had said, very quietly, "Is there a lawyer in this town who is not employed by the Fenton family?" Ellison had looked uncomfortable. He had said there was one attorney in Redemption, and that the attorney's primary clients were the Fentons and the three largest ranching operations in the county, all of which had significant business relationships with the Fentons. He had then said, lower and more quickly, that there was a circuit judge who came through every 6 weeks, and that the next visit was in 11 days, and that if someone had documentation suggesting fraud or usury, that would be the appropriate venue to raise it. Harriet had thanked him, gathered her documents, and turned toward the door, and that was when she had seen Abel McCrae, and her expression had made very clear that she had not known anyone was in the room, and that she was reassessing the last 10 minutes in light of that discovery, and that she was not yet certain whether that was good or bad. Abel had folded his newspaper and stood up and said, "I wasn't sent here by anyone. I'm not connected to the Fentons. My name is Abel McCrae, and I'm in redemption on entirely different business. But I couldn't help hearing what you just found out, and I think you should know that it's not safe for you to walk out of this office alone and go back to asking the questions you've been asking." She had looked at him for a long, measuring moment, and he had let her look, because it was a fair thing to do and because the look itself told him something important, that she was not the kind of woman who made fast decisions based on surface impressions, that she was genuinely weighing him, reading whatever information she could extract from the way he stood and the way he spoke and the things his face was or was not doing. Then she had said, "What kind of different business?" And he had said, "There's a man named Webb Lattimore who's been robbing stages and payrolls through this territory, and the Cattlemen's Association is paying me to find him." She had considered that for a moment. Then she had said, "That seems unlikely to intersect with my problem." And he had said very carefully, "Miss Baker, the Fenton family owns half this county, and they're not particularly concerned about who knows it. You found out this morning that they charged your father 270% annual interest on an $800 loan, and then attached that manufactured debt to his property. 11 days from now, there is a judge coming to town who might hear a fraud case. Between now and then, if the Fentons find out why you are here and what you found in that ledger, the situation becomes dangerous for you in ways that I do not think you have fully prepared for." She had been quiet again. Then she had said, "You are a stranger in this town who just happened to be in the land registrar's office at 8 in the morning, and you are suggesting I trust you." He had said, "No, I'm suggesting you be careful. What you do about it is your business." She had thought about that. Then she had said, "Are you any good?" He had said, "At what?" She had looked at the colt on his hip and then back at his face and said, "What you do?" He had said, "Yes." She had said, "All right, Mr. McCrae. I would appreciate your company for the walk back to the hotel." And that was how it had begun. They had sat in the hotel dining room for 2 hours that first morning, drinking coffee that was strong and bitter and not very good. And Harriet had shown him everything she had: the original bill of sale, the letter from Harlan Fenton, the documentation she had assembled from her father's papers. And Abel had listened to all of it and then sat for a while thinking, in the way that he had of being very still and very focused when he was turning something over. Then he had said, "Your father signed the second document." She had said, "Yes." He had said, "So the question isn't whether he owed money. The question is whether the interest rate constitutes fraud or usury, and whether the original loan had legitimate terms that were changed without your father's full knowledge or consent." She had said, "Yes." He had said, "Do you have any evidence that the terms were changed?" She had said, "Only the difference between what the bill of sale says and what the note at the registrar's office says. The bill of sale mentions an $800 friendly loan. The note mentions $3,000 plus accumulated penalties and interest. If the loan was really $3,000 from the beginning, why does the earlier document say 800? Abel had nodded slowly. Then he had said, "Do you know how your father came to borrow money from Harlan Fenton in the first place?" And Harriet had set down her coffee cup and looked out the window for a moment, and when she spoke her voice was even and controlled in the way of someone who has spent a lot of time keeping painful things at a manageable distance. She had told him that in the winter of 1878, A bad freeze had come through Graves Creek and destroyed a significant portion of the store's inventory. Her father had needed cash to restock before spring, and the two banks within reach had both declined to extend credit because the store's margins were already thin. She did not know exactly how Thomas Baker had come to be connected to Harlan Fenton, only that her father had come home from a trip to El Paso with $800 in cash and a somewhat evasive manner when she had asked him about it, and that over the following years there had been letters and one or two visits from Fenton representatives, and that her father had seemed increasingly worried and had not, as was his habit, discussed his worries with her. She had paused and then said, in that same carefully level voice, "My father was a proud man. He would not have told me he was in trouble until he absolutely had to. He died of a heart attack in April of last year and he never had the chance to tell me." Abel had said, "I'm sorry." She had looked at him in the way that people look at unexpected kindness when they have not been expecting it and are not quite sure what to do with it. Then she had said, "So am I." They had sat in quiet for a moment, and it was not an uncomfortable quiet which surprised them both. Then Abel had said, "There's a problem with the fraud argument, and it's this. Even if you can prove the interest calculation was predatory, the document exists with your father's signature on it. A judge on a 6-week circuit in 1882 is not going to invalidate a legal instrument based on arithmetic unless you have evidence that the terms were materially misrepresented to your father, and that means you need a witness, someone who was there when the loan was made or when the terms were changed." She had said, "I don't have one." He had said, "Not yet." She had looked at him. He had said, "The kind of loan shark operation you're describing doesn't usually run on one victim. If Harlan Fenton has been doing this to people, there are likely others who can speak to his methods. The question is whether any of them are still in the county and willing to talk." She had said, "And you think you can find them?" He had said, "I think we might find them, yes." She had looked at him for a long moment, and it was during that particular look that something shifted between them, some small and fundamental thing that neither of them could have articulated but that was nonetheless real. The awareness of the other person as a distinct presence rather than just a practical variable. It was not dramatic. It was very quiet. But it was the first moment of the story that mattered. She had said, "Why would you do this? You said you're here on other business." He had said, "I am, but I can work on both." She had said, "That's not what I asked." And he had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said, "No, I suppose it isn't." He had not answered the question directly, but he had not looked away from her either, and she had not pressed him, and they had ordered more coffee and begun to plan. Over the next 4 days they worked together in a way that was professionally efficient and personally careful, by which is meant that they were both very much aware of each other and both somewhat cautious about that awareness. Abel knew his own history well enough to be honest about it. He had not had the kind of life that produced settled habits or lasting connections. He had moved from place to place for 10 years doing work that required him to be either alone or in the company of people who were, at best, temporary. He had known women in those years, and in each case the knowing had ended in the same way, with him riding out of town on the next job, and it had always seemed fair because none of those women had seemed particularly surprised, and he had always been honest about what he was. Harriet Baker did not feel like that kind of temporary. She felt like the opposite of temporary, which was the specific thing that concerned him, because he was not at all certain what to do with that. Harriet, for her part, was dealing with her own complicated calculation. She was a 24-year-old woman alone in a hostile town with a legal problem, and a man she had known for less than a week who was being unexpectedly useful and unexpectedly honest, and who looked at her in a way that she found herself thinking about at odd moments, which was inconvenient. She had a store to save and a brother to write to, and 11 days before the circuit judge came to town, and she could not afford to be distracted. But she thought about the way he had said "I'm sorry" when she told him about her father, and the fact that he had not looked away when she held the look, and the way he had said "we might find them," and she thought about these things more than was strictly necessary. In the meantime, they found two people. The first was a man named Garrett Cole, who ran a small feed operation on the southern edge of the county and who, when Abel approached him directly and alone and told him what was being built toward a court appearance, had looked at the ground for a long moment and then said quietly that yes, Harlan Fenton had made him a loan in 1877 and that the terms had shifted on him in the second year in ways that the original agreement had not disclosed, and that he had paid out 3 times what he had originally borrowed just to keep his business, and that he had not complained because Fenton's people had made it very clear what happened to people who complained. He had agreed to speak to the judge. The second was a woman named Rosa Delgado, a Mexican-American widow who had lost her late husband's small cattle operation to a Fenton debt collection 2 years earlier. Rosa was careful and direct, and angry in the way that people are angry when they have been angry for a long time without anywhere to put it. She had papers of her own, documents she had kept hidden because she had suspected that someday they might matter. And when Harriet sat with her at her kitchen table in the small house where she now lived in town and showed her what she was building, Rosa had looked at everything with meticulous attention and said that what Harriet was describing matched her own experience precisely. Rosa Delgado would also speak to the judge. It was on the day that they secured Rosa's agreement, the 6th day after Harriet had arrived in Redemption, that Clyde Fenton found out why she was there. Abel found out before Harriet did, because the information came through the same networks that kept him connected to the movements of Webb Lattimore, through the saloon and the barber shop, and the informal communications of a small town that ran on gossip the way a clock runs on a mainspring. He heard that Clyde Fenton had been seen coming out of Ellison's office looking furious, and that he had subsequently been seen going into his father's office, and that there had been raised voices. Abel had gone immediately back to the hotel and found Harriet in the lobby writing a letter to her brother. He had sat down across from her and told her, plainly and without softening it, that the Fentons knew why she was here and that the situation had changed. She had put down her pen and said, "How changed?" he had said, significantly. She had looked at him, and the thing that he saw in her face in that moment was not fear, exactly, though fear was present. It was a kind of gathering, a drawing inward of everything she had and everything she was in preparation for what was coming. And it was one of the most deeply impressive things he had seen in a long time. She had said, "How much time do I have before the judge arrives?" He had said, 5 days. She had said, "Then we need to make sure the documentation is in order." He had said, "Harriet." The use of her first name surprised them both. It was the first time he had used it. She had looked at him very directly. He had said, "They are not going to let this go to a judge without trying to stop it first. I need you to understand what that means." She had been quiet for a moment, and then she had said, "I have been living in a town controlled by powerful men who do what they want and face no consequences my entire life, Mr. McCrae. I understand precisely what it means." He had said, "Then you understand why I'm not going to leave you alone in this hotel." She had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had said, very quietly, "No, I don't suppose I do." And there had been something in the quiet of that, something in the fact that they were sitting very still across a small hotel table from each other with the afternoon light coming through the dusty window, that made the space between them feel charged in a way that had nothing to do with the danger and everything to do with the two of them specifically, with Harriet Baker and Abel McCrae and the particular combination they made. She had picked up her pen again, but slowly, and he had not moved from the chair, and they had stayed there in the late afternoon for another hour, and she had written her letter and he had thought his own thoughts, and it was, all things considered, one of the better hours he had spent in recent memory. On the 7th day, Clyde Fenton came to the hotel. Abel had anticipated this, which was why he was sitting in the lobby when Clyde walked in, and why Clyde, who was a man of considerable arrogance and moderate intelligence, stopped when he saw Abel and made a fast assessment and decided to try the direct approach. He came to where Abel was sitting and said without introduction, "You're McCrae, the one who's been helping the Baker woman." Abel said, "I'm Abel McCrae, yes," Clyde said. "I'm going to ask you to step aside from this business. It's between the Baker woman and the Fenton family, and it's got nothing to do with a range detective from Colorado." Abel said, "I'm from Texas, actually, and I don't believe I'm involved in the legal matter. I'm just a guest at this hotel who happens to know Miss Baker," Clyde said. "Then as a guest at this hotel, let me give you some friendly advice. The Baker woman came here looking for a fight she can't win. She can either take what she's owed when we settle the property, or she can leave empty-handed. Those are the only two choices available to her, and anyone who thinks there's a third one is going to be very uncomfortable in this town very quickly." Abel said, "I appreciate the friendly advice." Clyde looked at him for a moment, trying to read something in the flat gray eyes that was not there to be read. Then he said, "You're not going to step aside." Abel said, "Miss Baker is a free person conducting legal business in a public county. I don't have any authority to stop her, and neither do you." Clyde's expression shifted from pleasant threat to something harder. He said, "My father owns this county." Abel said quietly, "No man owns a county. They just think they do until someone proves otherwise." Clyde had left. Abel had sat for a while longer in the lobby and then gone upstairs and knocked on Harriet's door and told her about the conversation, and she had listened to all of it without expression, and then she had said, "He's going to come back." Abel had said, "Yes," she had said, with more than words. He had said, "Yes." She had said, "I'm not leaving." He had said, "I know." She had looked at him for a moment, and then she had said, "Are you frightened, Mr. McCrae?" He had considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Then he had said, "No, are you?" She had said, "Yes." He had said, "That's the sensible response." And she had, briefly and unexpectedly, smiled, and it had been like watching sunlight come through a crack in a storm cloud, sudden and bright and gone again almost immediately, and Abel had stored it away with the same care he gave to information that might later be necessary. He had started sleeping across the hall from her door. She had noticed, because she noticed everything, and she had not said anything about it, which he had interpreted correctly as meaning she was not going to argue. On the 8th day, Harriet received another visitor. This one was not Clyde. This one was Harlan Fenton himself, who was 63 years old and white-haired and walked with a cane, and gave the immediate impression of a man who had been making other people uncomfortable with his presence for so long that he had forgotten how to do anything else. He came to the hotel dining room in the morning and sat down across from Harriet at breakfast and introduced himself with the courtliness of a man who has decided to try the civilized approach before escalating. And he said that he had heard she was a determined young woman and that he respected that, and that he wanted to offer her a settlement. He would forgive the debt entirely, he said, and allow her to retain possession of the Graves Creek store and property, in exchange for her immediate departure from redemption and her agreement not to pursue any legal action against the Fenton family in any court in any territory. Harriet had said, very calmly, and Garrett Cole, and Rosa Delgado. Harlan Fenton had looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he had said that their situations were separate matters and not her concern. Harriet had said, "What you did to my father, you also did to them, and to others, I suspect. I am not willing to settle my own situation and leave theirs unaddressed." Harlan had said, with a precision that made the threat very clear, "Miss Baker, this is not a negotiation. This is an offer. It will not be made a second time, and the alternative to accepting it is something I would prefer you not to experience." Harriet had said, "Then I suppose I will not be accepting your offer." Harlan Fenton had looked at her for a very long moment, and then he had stood up and left. Abel, who had been at the next table with coffee and a hat pulled low, had watched Harlan leave and then looked at Harriet, and she had been very pale but very straight in her chair, and she had picked up her coffee cup with a hand that he could see, across the small distance between them, was not entirely steady. He had moved to her table. She had looked at him and said, "I keep doing the brave thing and then my hands shake." He had said, "That's what courage looks like. If you weren't afraid, it wouldn't be courage." She had looked down at her hands and then back at him and said, "My father would have liked you." Something in his chest had shifted when she said that, some structural thing that had been in its current configuration for a long time, and the shifting was slow and deep, and not painful exactly, but not comfortable either, and he had sat with her at that table until her hands stopped shaking. On the 9th day, 3 men followed Harriet when she went to visit Rosa Delgado. Abel was following them from half a block behind, which was why what happened was an inconvenience rather than a disaster. He had come forward quickly when the 3 men stopped her in the alley behind Rosa Street, and the combination of his presence and the Colt he had drawn without drama had produced a rapid reassessment in all 3 men, and they had departed with some haste. Harriet had stood in the alley afterward and said nothing for a moment. Then she had said, "Thank you." He had said, "Are you hurt?" She had said, "No, they hadn't done anything yet." He had said, "They were going to." She had said, "I know." There had been a moment then, in the alley behind Rosa Delgado's street, with the afternoon sun cutting down between the buildings and the smell of the town around them, in which the distance between them felt very small, and the significance of that distance felt very large. Abel had put away his Colt and looked at her, and she had looked back, and neither of them had said anything, and the silence had held something that was not quite a conversation, but was more than its absence. Then she had said, "Will you tell me something true?" He had said, "Yes." She had said, "Why are you really still here? You said you were looking for Webb Lattimore. You haven't mentioned him in 6 days." He had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, "I found him." She had said, "When?" He had said, "3rd day I was here. He's hiding in a line camp on the Fenton property, which tells you something about the Fenton family that has nothing to do with usury." She had stared at him. Then she had said, "And you stayed?" He had said, "I stayed." She had looked at him with an expression that he could not fully decode, which was unusual because he was very good at reading faces, and he thought that perhaps what he was seeing was the specific expression of a person who is learning something they had not allowed themselves to fully hope for, the dangerous and necessary business of revising their expectations upward. She had said, "Abel." It was the first time she had used his given name. He had said, "Yes." She had said, "I am going to finish what I came here to do." He had said, "I know," she had said, "and then I would like to talk to you about what comes after." He had said, "So would I." And they had walked back to the hotel, side by side, not touching but close, and the whole long wait of the last 9 days had felt different, lighter, as though something that had been held in suspension had finally begun, slowly, to settle. On the 10th day, everything went sideways. It started with Garrett Cole withdrawing his agreement to speak to the judge. He came to the hotel early in the morning before Harriet had finished breakfast, and he was pale and would not look directly at either of them, and he said that he had reconsidered, and that he did not think his situation was relevant to Harriet's case, and that he would not be appearing before the judge. Harriet had said, "Mr. Cole, what happened?" He had said nothing for a moment. Then in a very low voice he had said that 3 men had ridden past his house in the night and stopped for a while in the road, and that his wife was frightened and that he had children. Harriet had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said very gently, "I understand, Mr. Cole. I would not ask you to put your family at risk for my case." After he had gone, she had sat at the table looking at the window, and Abel had let her think. Then she had said, "Rosa is next." He had said, "I'll go to her." Harriet had said, "We'll both go." They had gone to Rosa's house and found that she knew already. 2 of the men who had followed Harriet the previous day had apparently made a visit to Rosa as well. And Rosa, who was alone and who had no husband to think of but who had a sister with small children living 3 streets over, had her own calculation to make. But Rosa Delgado was not Garrett Cole. Rosa had sat at her kitchen table and looked at Harriet and said, in Spanish-accented English that was precise and clear and entirely without hesitation, "They burned my husband's cattle operation to the ground in 1879, Miss Baker. They said it was an accident. It was not an accident. And they have been living in this county for 3 more years collecting what does not belong to them. I will speak to the judge. Harriet had reached across the table and taken Rosa's hand, and Rosa had let her, and the two women had sat there for a moment, and Abel, watching from across the small kitchen, had thought that he was watching the particular kind of courage that did not come from the absence of fear, but from something that survived alongside it, and it was the most human thing he had seen in a long time. They had spent the rest of the day organizing what they had. Rosa's documents. Harriet's documents. The public record Ellison had shown her. The arithmetic of the interest calculation laid out clearly on paper. The timeline from Thomas Baker's original $800 loan in 1878 to the $3,000 debt instrument filed in 1880. It was not, Abel knew, a certainty. A circuit judge in 1882 operating in a county owned by one family had considerable latitude and considerable pressure. But it was something, and it was carefully built, and it was honest. He had said as they finished, "You've done everything you can do." She had said, "I know." He had said, "Whatever happens with the judge, you should know that what you did here was right." She had looked at him and said, "Are you trying to prepare me for losing?" He had said, "I'm trying to tell you that I think you're remarkable." She had been very still for a moment. Then she had said, "Abel." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "After the judge." He had said, "After the judge." And they had both known, without saying it, what they meant by that. On the morning of the 11th day before the judge arrived, Clyde Fenton made his last mistake. He came into the street in front of the hotel, in the full middle of redemption on a clear spring morning, with 2 men behind him, and he called out for Abel McCrae to come and face him. And the language he used was explicitly and deliberately aggressive in the way of a man who has decided that the direct method is the only one left, and who does not care much about his own safety when his blood is up. Abel had been in the hotel lobby when the call came, and he had looked at Harriet, who was beside him, and she had looked back at him with the expression of a woman who is about to tell a man not to go and who already knows she is not going to say it, because she understands that this is not something that words can stop. He had said, "Stay inside." She had said, "Abel." He had said, "Harriet, stay inside." She had held his eyes for a long moment, and the look between them contained a whole conversation that neither of them had the time to have. The conversation about what came after, about the things they had both been carefully not saying for 11 days, about the question of what a woman like her and a man like him could build if they were given the chance. He had gone out into the street. Clyde Fenton was standing 20 feet away with 2 men flanking him, and there was a crowd already gathered along the storefronts, the inevitable audience that gathered for these things in frontier towns, part morbid and part practical, always hoping for resolution even when resolution was ugly. Abel had stopped in the middle of the street, and then he had done something that no one expected, because it was not the kind of thing men usually did in these situations. He had looked, not at Clyde Fenton, but at the crowd. He had scanned the faces on the boardwalks until he found the one face he was looking for, and when he found it he had asked, not loudly but clearly enough to be heard by the men near her, "What's your name?" The man next to Harriet, startled by the question, had said he did not know. And Harriet, from the doorway of the hotel where she had not stayed inside because of course she had not, had heard Abel ask and had understood, in a way she could not have explained, what the question meant. It meant he was marking a moment. It meant he was acknowledging that she existed and that she mattered before this thing happened, that she was the reason he was standing in this street instead of the next county over, that she was the answer to the question of why he had stayed. Then he had turned back to Clyde Fenton. What followed was not long. Clyde was fast, genuinely fast, faster than Abel had expected, and the 2 men beside him moved at the same moment, and the sequence of events that resulted was chaotic and loud and terrifying to everyone watching. Abel drew and put his first shot through Clyde Fenton's right hand, the gun hand, because he was trying not to kill the man if he did not have to. But Clyde reached with his left hand for a second pistol at his hip, and that was the decision that ended things, and Abel put the second shot where it had to go. One of the two flanking men had his gun out but hesitated, and that hesitation was long enough for Abel to shift his aim, and the man made the correct assessment and put his hands up. The other man had, at some earlier point in the sequence, turned and walked rapidly away, which was its own kind of decision. The whole thing had taken perhaps 12 seconds. Abel stood in the street with the smoke clearing around him and blood from the cut above his eye, where a shot had grazed him close enough to leave a mark, running down the side of his face, and he turned from the body of Clyde Fenton and looked at Harriet Baker, and he asked her name, and she told him. And the whole long wait of 11 days resolved itself in that exchange, in those 4 words, Harriet Baker and Abel McCrae, standing in the dust and the smoke and the aftermath of all of it, with the story they had been building together not yet finished, but no longer uncertain in its essential direction. The circuit judge arrived that afternoon. His name was Judge Calvin Reeves, and he was 61 and compact, and had the look of a man who had heard a great deal in his life, and was not easily impressed or easily frightened. He set up in the Redemption Courthouse, which was also the town hall and occasionally the saloon's overflow room, and he began hearing cases the following morning. Harriet's case was the 3rd on the docket. Abel sat in the back of the room. He had cleaned up and changed his clothes, and the cut above his eye was bandaged, and he looked, as much as it was possible for him to look, like a man who had not killed anyone 24 hours earlier. The sheriff, Dooley, had come to see him the previous afternoon with a great deal of nervous energy, and the provisional conclusion that the shooting had been in self-defense, which it had been, and that no charges would be filed, and Abel had thanked him with a courtesy that did not acknowledge the sheriff's obvious relief. Harlan Fenton did not come to the courthouse. He had lawyers, and the lawyers came instead, and they were good lawyers, prepared and composed, and they presented the debt instrument with Thomas Baker's signature, and the recorded filing and the chain of documentation in clear and professional terms. Harriet presented her case herself. She stood before Judge Reeves and laid it out with the precision and the thoroughness of someone who had organized it very carefully and who knew it cold, and she was not nervous exactly, though she was very focused, and her voice was clear and steady, and she did not look once at the lawyers on the other side of the room. She showed him the original bill of sale. She showed him the timeline. She showed him the mathematics of the interest calculation and named the rate. She showed him the disparity between the $800 original loan and the $3,000 debt instrument. Then Rosa Delgado stood up and added her account. Judge Reeves had listened to all of it without expression, asking occasional precise questions. Then he had looked at the Fenton lawyers and asked them to explain the interest calculation in the debt instrument. There was a considerable amount of legal language in their explanation, but the substance of it was that the terms of the original loan allowed for compounding interest and additional charges in case of extended non-payment, and that the $3,000 figure was arrived at within the contractual terms. Judge Reeves had said, in a very dry tone, at an annual rate of approximately 270%. The lawyers had said that the rate was within what was permissible by contract. Judge Reeves had said, "Are you aware that the New Mexico and Texas territorial courts have in several recent rulings taken the position that contractual interest rates that are unconscionably disproportionate to the principal may be deemed invalid on grounds of equity?" The lawyers had said they were aware of this, but that the relevant precedents were not controlling in this jurisdiction. Judge Reeves had said, "I am the jurisdiction." There had been a silence in the room. Then the judge had looked at Harriet and said, "The debt instrument against the Baker property in Graves Creek is hereby invalidated on grounds of inequitable terms. The original loan of $800, together with a reasonable rate of interest as I shall calculate, remains valid. The Fenton estate will have 90 days to provide an accounting of all payments made against the Baker account, which I expect to demonstrate that the original debt has already been substantially, if not entirely, satisfied. The Baker property is not subject to seizure under this instrument. He had then turned to Rosa Delgado's case, and there was much more legal complexity there, because the property had already changed hands, and the resolution was not as clean. But the judge had ordered a full accounting of the original Delgado loan and the disposition of the seized property, and had directed that if the accounting showed the debt had been satisfied by the time of seizure, restitution proceedings would be initiated. It was not a perfect victory. Nothing in the real world was. But when Harriet walked out of that courthouse into the afternoon sun with her documents in her satchel and her head up, Abel McCrae was waiting on the steps, and he looked at her face and knew before she said anything. And something that had been tight in his chest since the morning of the 11th day released slowly, like a spring unwinding. She had stopped on the step above him, which put them at eye level with each other, and she had looked at him for a moment before she said anything, and then she had said, "The property is safe." He had said, "I heard." She had said, "Rosa's case is more complicated." He had said, "I know, she's not done fighting." She had said, "No." And there had been a small, real smile then, not the brief flicker he had seen before, but a fuller thing, something that reached her eyes. "She is not the kind of woman who stops fighting." He had said, "Neither are you." She had looked at him steadily for a moment, and the afternoon light was behind him, and the town was going about its ordinary business around them, and somewhere a horse was being shod and the smell of wood smoke was in the air, and Harriet Baker said, "I need to go home, Abel." He had said, "I know," she had said, "to Graves Creek. There's a store to run and paperwork to file and a letter to write to my brother who is going to be extremely relieved." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "And what are you going to do?" He had looked at her for a moment, and the question was simple on its surface and not simple at all underneath, and they both knew it. He had said, "I have $200 coming from the Cattlemen's Association for Webb Lattimore." She had said, "And after that," he had said, "I've never been to Graves Creek." She had been very still for a moment, then she had said, "It is not a remarkable town." He had said, "Some things about it might be." And she had looked at him, and he had looked at her, and the story that had been building between them for 11 days in a hostile town was not finished yet, not even close, but it had turned from something uncertain into something with a direction, and that direction was forward, and they both knew where it was pointing. They left redemption on the same stage, though Abel had initially suggested he might ride, and Harriet had said that if he rode she would not be able to finish telling him about Daniel and the law school in Santa Fe, and the time their father had accidentally ordered 300 pounds of sugar instead of salt, and the store had smelled extraordinary for a month, and they had all been slightly sick of sweetness for a year afterward. He had bought a stage ticket. The stage from Redemption to the connecting line that would take them eventually to Graves Creek ran twice a week, and they had 2 days to wait for it, and they spent those 2 days doing the kind of ordinary things that people do when the emergency is over, and what remains is the actual fabric of knowing each other. They ate meals together. They walked along the creek that ran behind the south side of town. He told her about Colorado and the ranch where he had worked at 17, and the foreman who had first taught him that a gun was a tool and not a solution, and the particular way that lesson had taken 3 years to fully learn. She told him about her mother and the typhoid summer, and the way her father had changed afterward, quieter and more intent, as though he was trying to get through the days faster to get to the part where things were all right again. He told her about the army and the scouting and the things he had seen on the frontier that he still carried, the wars and the displacements, and the people he had encountered on both sides of lines that should not have been drawn the way they were. And his voice when he spoke about those things was careful and honest in the way of someone who has examined his own part in something difficult and has not absolved himself too easily. She told him about the store and the accounts and the way she had learned to read the ledgers when she was 12 and discovered that numbers, unlike most things in her world, behaved exactly as they promised, and the particular satisfaction of a column that balanced. She asked him, on the second evening, sitting on the steps of the hotel in the early dark with the stars coming out over the Texas plain, whether he had ever thought about what he wanted to do when the moving stopped. He had been quiet for a long time. Then he had said, "I never thought it would stop." She had said, "And now?" He had turned and looked at her in the dark, and the look was direct and clear, and without any of the careful professional distance he had maintained for the first days, and he said, "Now I think it might." She had said, "That is a large change." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "Are you frightened?" He had said, "Considerably." She had laughed, a real laugh, the first full one he had heard from her, and it was warm and genuine and cut through the evening air like something alive, and he sat with it for a moment before he did anything else, just held the sound of it. Then he had reached out and taken her hand very carefully, and she had looked down at their hands and then up at him, and she had not moved her hand away. They had sat like that on the hotel steps in Redemption, Texas, under the spring stars of 1882, until the night got cold enough to send them inside. And when she had said good night at the top of the stairs, she had looked at him with an expression that contained, for the first time since they had met, no guardedness at all. The stage to Graves Creek took 2 days, with a night stop at a relay station in the Texas Panhandle where the food was plain and the beds were thin mattresses on wooden frames, and the other passengers were a cattle buyer and his wife and a young minister who was going to a new posting and who prayed quietly to himself before sleeping. Abel and Harriet talked for most of both days. They talked about everything and they talked about nothing, and the ease of the talking was itself a revelation to both of them. The discovery that the person across from you could be the person you wanted to tell things to. That conversation could be a pleasure rather than an exercise. She told him about the books her father had kept, a small collection of novels and histories and scientific texts that had been their family's luxury, and about reading Dickens by lamplight at 12 years old, and understanding for the first time that other worlds were possible. He told her about teaching himself to read properly from an almanac when he was 14, and about the first real book he had read cover to cover, a worn copy of Moby Dick that a school teacher on a Kansas stage had left behind, and about the particular feeling of finishing a book for the first time and not knowing what to do with yourself, because the world inside it had become more real than the world outside. She had said, "You keep surprising me." He had said, "How?" She had said, "I expected a gunfighter, I got a person." He had said, "I'm both." She had said, "I know. I find I don't mind the second one interfering with the first." The cattle buyer's wife, who had been listening to this exchange with the cheerful eavesdropping of a confined space, had smiled into her knitting. When they arrived in Graves Creek, it was late afternoon, and the town was exactly as Harriet had described it. Not remarkable, a main street and a collection of supporting structures, and the particular slightly worn quality of a place that was working hard and not getting rich. The dry goods store was visible from the stage stop, its painted sign slightly faded, its window dusty from being closed for 3 weeks. Harriet had looked at it from the stage step, and something in her face had shifted, something private and deep, relief perhaps or recognition, the complicated feeling of coming home when home has nearly been taken from you. Abel had stepped down from the stage and offered her his hand for the last step, and she had taken it, and she had held it a moment longer than strictly necessary, and he had let her. She had said, "Come and have supper. I owe you at least that much." He had said, "You owe me nothing." She had said, "I know. Come and have supper anyway." He had come, and supper in Harriet Baker's kitchen above the dry goods store, with the evening light coming through the window over the sink and bread and beans, and the particular comfort of a real meal in a real place after weeks of hotel dining rooms, had been one of the best meals of Abel McCrae's life, and he had eaten it in a small chair at a small table across from Harriet Baker, and thought with perfect clarity that he did not want to leave this kitchen. He had said, very quietly, "I need to deliver my report on Lattimore to the Cattlemen's Association. I'll be riding out tomorrow." She had said without looking up from her plate. "And when will you ride back?" He had said. "How long do you need?" She had looked up then. She had said, "For what?" He had said. "To decide whether you want what I think you might want." She had been very still. Then she had said, "I am a 24-year-old woman who has been running her father's store alone for a year and fighting a legal battle against a corrupt land baron for the past 3 weeks. I know my own mind considerably better than most people twice my age." He had said, "That's what I suspected." She had said, "Then you don't need me to take time." He had said, "Harriet." She had said, "Abel." The evening light had gone amber and the kitchen had been warm, and outside the window the town of Graves Creek was doing its ordinary evening things. And Abel McCrae had looked at Harriet Baker across the small table and said the words that he had been building toward for 11 days and 2 on a stage and 1 supper in a kitchen. He had said, "I would like to stop moving." She had said, very quietly, "Then stop." He had reached across the table, and she had taken his hand, and neither of them had let go for a long time. Abel rode out the next morning with his report and returned 11 days later with his $200 and a letter from his bank in Abilene transferring the small sum he had saved over years of careful living. He came back to Graves Creek on a Wednesday, and he rode directly to the dry goods store, and Harriet was behind the counter when he came through the door, and she looked up from her ledger and said, very calmly, "You're back." He had said, "I said I would be." She had said, "Yes, you did." He had looked around the store and said, "The window needs repainting." She had said, "I know." He had said, "I'll do it." She had said, "Do you know how to paint signs?" He had said, "No." She had said, "Neither do I, we'll figure it out." He had smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that was not a social gesture but a genuine expression of something internal, and she had seen it, and the sight of it had done something to her chest that she was beginning to accept as a permanent condition. Over the following weeks, Abel McCrae settled into Graves Creek with a quiet thoroughness that surprised people who had expected a drifting gunfighter to drift on. He found work doing the things he was good at, tracking down a small rancher's stolen horses, helping settle a property dispute between 2 neighboring operations, and the money he earned he put toward the small hotel room he was renting until he could find something more permanent. He spent evenings at the store. He was useful, which Harriet appreciated with the directness of a practical woman, and he was good company, which she appreciated with the directness of a person who had been somewhat lonely for a long time without letting herself dwell on it. He fixed the window hinge that had been sticking for a month. He reorganized the supply shelves in a way that made the inventory count faster, and when she pointed out one flaw in his system, she did it with a precision that made him listen and then revise. And the fact that he listened and revised without defensiveness was something she noted carefully. He was learning Graves Creek. He was learning the people in it and the way it worked and the particular texture of a settled place, which was different from the texture of the frontier he had been moving through, different, and he was discovering better. Harriet's brother Daniel arrived from Santa Fe 6 weeks after Harriet returned, having finished his coursework and passed his territorial bar examination. And he arrived with the energy of a young man of 22 who had been doing very important work and was ready to be recognized for it. And within approximately 30 minutes of meeting Abel McCrae, he had made 2 things clear. First, that he intended to make the fraud case against Harlan Fenton a matter of broader territorial legal significance, and second, that he entirely approved of the man currently sitting in his sister's kitchen. He had said this last thing to Abel directly, which had made Abel look at him with a slightly startled expression, and Daniel had said, "I'm a lawyer, I speak plainly." Abel had said, "I appreciate that." Daniel had said, "She hasn't smiled like that since before our father died." Abel had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, "I intend to do my best to keep that going." Daniel had said, "Good. Now tell me about Webb Lattimore and the Fenton connection. because I think that might be the peace I need." They had talked for 3 hours, and by the end of it Daniel Baker had the outlines of a case that, when he eventually brought it before the territorial court in Santa Fe, would result in Harlan Fenton paying restitution to 14 identified victims of his lending practices, including Rosa Delgado, whose seized property was eventually returned to her after a legal process that took 18 months and exhausted everyone involved but ended correctly. But that was later. In the summer of 1882, in Graves Creek, New Mexico Territory, Abel McCrae asked Harriet Baker to marry him on the evening of a particularly fine July day, on the steps of the dry goods store with the sky going purple and gold above the desert. And he did it without a ring because he had not thought to bring one, which she later told him was the most characteristic thing about him, and she had said yes before he finished the sentence. They were married in October by the circuit preacher who came through Graves Creek every 6 weeks, in the small church that served the town's Protestant congregation, with Daniel Baker standing up as witness and Rosa Delgado, who had made the trip from Redemption specifically for the occasion, sitting in the front pew with an expression of profound satisfaction. Harriet wore her mother's dark blue dress, which she had carefully preserved for years against exactly this kind of occasion, and Abel wore a clean white shirt and his good black coat and had, for once, made a genuine effort with his hair. And when the preacher said the words and Abel looked at Harriet, standing beside him in her mother's dress in the small church in Graves Creek, with the October light coming through the windows, something in him settled so completely and so finally that it felt like the closing of a very long chapter, not an ending but an arrival, the feeling of having been traveling for a long time and having finally come to the place where the road had always been. Leading, he said, "I do," in a voice that was very steady. She said, "I do," in a voice that was also very steady, but her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with steadiness. They were married. The store prospered. It did not prosper dramatically, because Graves Creek was not a dramatic place economically, but it grew steadily, and Abel's contribution to it was real, because he had spent 10 years learning to read people and situations, and that skill translated surprisingly well to the business of running a mercantile operation. He had a gift for credit assessment that surprised Harriet until she thought about it more carefully, and he handled the supply negotiations with the traveling merchants who came through with a calm directness that regularly resulted in better terms than Harriet had previously been able to obtain. She kept the books. He managed the supply lines and the occasional difficulties that arose when customers or suppliers were not entirely honest. Daniel managed the legal matters. In the spring of 1883, Harriet told Abel she was expecting, and he had sat very still for a moment and then looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something younger and less certain than his usual composure, something that looked like a man confronting a happiness so large he was not sure how to hold it. She had said, "You're terrified." He had said, "Completely." She had said, "That's appropriate, I am too." He had said, "We'll figure it out." She had said, "Yes, we will." Their son was born in October of 1883, a solid and loud and entirely healthy baby who arrived in the world with great energy and the particular determination that, Harriet said, appeared to be a family trait. They named him Thomas for her father, and Daniel came from Santa Fe to see him and held him with the elaborate care of a man handling something precious and slightly explosive, and Rosa sent a blanket she had made herself, blue and white and warm. Thomas was a fine baby, and then a fine toddler, and then a fine small boy who had his father's gray eyes and his mother's direct gaze, and who began, at age 3, attempting to reorganize the store shelves with the gravity and purpose of a man who had a clear system in mind, which made both his parents laugh. Abel McCrae did not ride out for work in the old way anymore. He had left it gradually, the year after their wedding, turning down first the longer jobs and then the shorter ones, until the remaining work was entirely local, the kind of practical problem-solving that any community required, and that a man with his particular skills could handle without leaving. He had expected this to feel like a diminishment and discovered, entirely to his surprise, that it did not. What the moving had given him was a substitute for the thing he had not yet found. What he had found did not require a substitute. There were, once, 2 years into their marriage, 3 men who came to Graves Creek looking for him, men from an old job in Colorado who had convinced themselves they had a grievance. Abel had handled the situation quietly and thoroughly, and with the minimum possible drama, and afterward Harriet had sat with him in the kitchen while he cleaned and oiled his colt with the patient care he always gave it, and she had not said anything for a long time. Then she had said, "Is this likely to happen again?" He had said, "Unlikely." She had said, "But possible." He had said, "There is always that possibility. I cannot entirely undo who I was." She had thought about this for a moment. Then she had said, "I know who you were. I know who you are now. Those 2 things exist at the same time, and I have no interest in pretending otherwise." He had looked at her. She had said, "I married you knowing what your past contained. I did not marry a fiction." He had said, "Harriet," she had said, "do not look at me like that." He had said, "Like what?" She had said, "Like I've said something surprising. You should expect by now that I say what I mean." He had briefly smiled, and then he had put down the colt and taken her hand, and she had let him hold it in both of his, and they had sat in the quiet of the kitchen with the night around them, and the sound of Thomas sleeping above them and the store below them, and all of it entirely real and entirely theirs. In the fall of 1885, their second child arrived. A girl this time, which delighted Thomas, who was 2, and did not fully understand what a sister was but was enthusiastically in favor of her. They named her Clara, and she had her mother's dark hair and her father's absolute calm in the face of novelty, looking at the world with a composed interest that made the people who met her smile. Daniel Baker had by this time established himself as one of the more capable younger attorneys in the New Mexico Territory, and his work on the Fenton usury cases had been written up in a Santa Fe newspaper and cited in a subsequent territorial court ruling. He came to Graves Creek every few months and ate at their table, and argued with Harriet about politics, and argued with Abel about strategy, and played with his niece and nephew with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a man who intended to have his own family eventually, but was in no particular hurry. He had also, by 1885, begun a quiet courtship with a young woman from Santa Fe named Elena, whom he brought to Graves Creek for the first time in December of that year, and who sat at Harriet's kitchen table and talked with her for 4 hours while Daniel and Abel were discussing the water rights dispute that had just come up between 2 of the local ranching operations. Harriet had given her opinion to Daniel afterward, which was that Elena was exceptionally intelligent and more patient than he deserved, and Daniel had grinned and said he was aware of both things. Rosa Delgado had, by the mid-1880s, rebuilt. The restitution from the Fenton proceedings had been partial but meaningful, and combined with her own considerable determination and some practical help from the community that had felt the obligation of long overdue recognition, she had established a small but viable cattle operation. She wrote to Harriet regularly, letters that were clear and practical and occasionally funny, and she came to visit once a year. And when she came, she and Harriet sat in the kitchen for long evenings talking about the things that women talked about when they were free to be honest, the work and the money and the children and the particular complicated joy of having built something that belonged to you. The Fenton operation in redemption had been considerably diminished by Daniel's legal work. Harlan Fenton had died in 1884, and the estate had been divided among various heirs, none of whom had their father's particular combination of ambition and ruthlessness, and the county that had been described as belonging to the Fenton family was, by 1886, a somewhat more ordinary place. Abel heard this news with the particular quiet satisfaction of someone who has watched something unjust begin to collapse and has had a small part in pushing it over, and he mentioned it to Harriet one evening over the supper table, and she had been quiet for a moment and then said, "I hope Rosa knows." He had said, "I'll write to her." She had said, "I already did." In the winter of 1887, Harriet discovered she was expecting again, and Abel's reaction was measurably more composed this time, though not less genuine. He said, "Another boy, do you think?" She had said, "I have no idea." He had said, "Either would be fine." She had said, "Yes." It was another boy, born in the summer of 1888, and they named him James, and he arrived into a household that was, by this time, well practiced in babies and entirely at ease with the organized chaos of two existing children who were both deeply interested in the new arrival. Thomas was 4 and considered himself an authority on the subject, having been through this once already. Clara was 2 and approached James with a scientific interest that was almost alarming in its intensity. The store continued to grow. Abel had, by this time, taken on a hired assistant, a young man from the Mexican settlement south of town named Miguel, who was 17 and very capable, and who learned the supply systems in 3 months and improved them in the 4th, which Abel had told Harriet was the most encouraging sign of competence he knew, that a person looked at what you had built and made it better rather than simply operating it. There was a period in the late 1880s when a new railroad spur was being considered for the region, and if it had come through Graves Creek, it would have changed the town substantially. The spur went elsewhere, as spurs often did, determined by the usual combination of geography and politics and money, and Graves Creek remained what it was, a working town of modest size doing its ordinary business. Abel had watched the railroad decision play out without the anxious investment that some of the other merchants showed. He had said to Harriet, when the final routing was announced and it was clear that Graves Creek was not on it, "We're all right." She had said, "Yes, we are." He had said, "I know some people are disappointed." She had said, "They'll adjust, we always do." He had looked at her across the kitchen table, this woman he had been married to for 7 years, who was 31 years old and who had the competent, contained, absolutely real quality that she had had when he first saw her stepping off a stage in Redemption with a leather satchel, and a determination that cost her effort to maintain, and who now moved through their life and their business and their family with the kind of settled ease that came from having built something real and knowing it. He had said very simply, "I love you." She had looked at him, and the look had in it all 7 years, all the mornings and evenings and arguments and agreements and children and work, and the particular quality of a life that had been built by 2 people who chose each other clearly and kept choosing. She had said, "I know." He had raised an eyebrow. She had smiled and said, "I love you too. I simply said I know first because you should know that I know." He had said, "That is an extremely Harriet Baker way to respond to a declaration of love." She had said, "I am an extremely Harriet Baker kind of person." He had said, "Yes, you are, it's my favorite thing." The 1890s came in with drought and the particular hard patience that the West required of the people who stayed in it. The store's margins tightened, as they tightened for everyone. Abel took on more of the regional work that he had once done exclusively, not the dangerous kind but the practical kind, and it kept them steady. Harriet expanded into dry goods lines that the railroad towns were not yet offering to the smaller operations, specialty items, medical supplies, school materials, things that a functioning community needed, and that she had figured out how to source at good prices through the relationships she had been building for a decade. Thomas was 12 by 1895, and it was clear by then that he was going to be his Uncle Daniel's student, because what he wanted from the world was not the store but the legal system, and Daniel took him for a summer in Santa Fe when he was 14 and came back saying the boy had a sharper legal mind than 3 of his current clients combined. Clara had her father's observational skills, and her mother's organizational gift in a combination that was remarkable to watch. By the time she was 10, she was helping with the accounts, not as a novelty, but because she was genuinely useful, and the accuracy with which she caught discrepancies in the columns was a source of considerable professional pride to her. James was the outdoors child, the one who was most at ease on a horse, who came home with mud on his boots and wildflowers in his pockets, who was curious about everything that grew and moved and ran in the land around them, and who would eventually, though this was some years away, come back to the land in a different way, studying agriculture at a school in Albuquerque, and then returning to Graves Creek to work a small piece of the territory in ways that made it better. Abel McCrae at 40 was a settled man, which was something he could not have imagined at 25, and which he found entirely and without reservation good. The gray in his hair had come gradually and without drama. The lines in his face were the honest lines of a man who had spent years outdoors in the western sun. He could still, when the occasion required, handle himself in a difficult situation with the precision and economy that had kept him alive for 30 years. But the occasions required it less and less, and that too was entirely good. He had, at 42, taken the Colt from its holster and put it in the box in the cabinet above the kitchen shelves where it stayed now, except on rare occasions. Not because it had become suddenly unnecessary to know where it was and to be able to reach it, but because the daily habit of wearing it no longer reflected the daily reality of his life, and he was a man who believed in honesty between what you were doing and what you showed the world. Harriet had watched him put it away and said nothing, but she had looked at him in a way that held something warm and complete, and he had understood that she knew what the gesture meant, and that she received it as it was intended. They had sat on the steps of the store that evening, the way they sometimes did when the days were long and the light was good, with the sounds of the town around them and the children somewhere in the house behind them, and Harriet had leaned her head against his shoulder and he had put his arm around her, and they had watched Graves Creek go about its evening business in the golden light of a late summer day in 1897. He had said, 15 years. She had said, almost exactly. He had said, I came to Redemption looking for a man named Webb Lattimore, she had said, and found considerably more trouble. He had said, yes, she had said, was it worth it? He had said without any hesitation at all, every single thing. She had been quiet for a moment, and then she had said in the voice she used for important things, the voice that was very even and very precise because she was being absolutely honest, when you turned in that street in Redemption and looked for me before you did anything else, I understood something I had not expected to understand. He had said, what was that? She had said, that you had already decided I mattered. Before the fight, before any of it, you looked to find me first. He had said, yes, she had said, I have thought about that moment many times. He had said, so have I, she had said, you asked my name. He had said, I needed to know it, she had said, and you made sure you were standing afterward so you could come back and hear the answer. He had said, that was the plan. She had turned her head slightly to look at him, close and warm and entirely familiar after all these years, and said, it was a very good plan. He had said, thank you, she had said, you are very welcome, Abel McCrae. The evening had come down around them in the way that evenings came down in the desert southwest, suddenly and beautifully, the sky going from gold to amber to deep blue to the first appearance of the stars, and the town had quieted into its nighttime rhythms. And inside the house, Thomas was reading, and Clara was finishing her arithmetic, and James was probably already asleep. And the store below them held the accumulated order of 15 years of work, and everything was exactly what they had made it. He had said, what did you think when I walked across that street toward you? She had smiled, and the smile had in it all of what she was, the practicality and the depth and the particular clear-eyed warmth of a woman who had seen real things and chosen to remain open anyway. She had said, I thought that man has very determined eyes. He had said, and, she had said, and I hope he keeps walking. He had pulled her a little closer. She had said, and he did. They had sat there on the steps of their store in the quiet of the evening until the stars were fully out, and then they had gone inside to their children and their kitchen and their life, and the door had closed behind them on another ordinary extraordinary day, and outside Graves Creek settled into the warm dark of a southwestern summer night, unhurried and real and entirely alive. There was nothing left unfinished between them. There had not been for a very long time. In the spring of 1898, a letter came from Daniel saying that he and Alina were expecting their second child, and that his oldest boy, who was 4, had already announced his intention to become a lawyer like his father, which was either gratifying or alarming depending on your perspective. In the fall of that same year, Thomas Baker McCrae left for Santa Fe to begin his legal studies, carrying a letter of introduction from his Uncle Daniel and his mother's practical advice, and his father's quietly given instruction on how to read a room and a person, which was as useful in law, Thomas would later say, as anywhere else he had encountered. Rosa Delgado came to visit that fall as she always did, and she and Harriet sat in the kitchen for an evening while Abel and Clara played cards at the table and James slept and the fire burned low. And Rosa talked about the range, and the seasons, and the cattle, and the particular satisfaction of land that was yours, honestly and completely yours. And Harriet listened with the fullness that she gave to things that mattered. And afterward, Abel had watched the two women say good night in the doorway, and had thought about redemption in 1882, and the land registrar's office, and the way Harriet had reached across the table and taken Rosa's hand, and about how the decisions that people make in the worst moments of their lives sometimes ripple out in ways that keep mattering long after the worst moment is gone. He had said to Harriet when Rosa had gone to her room, "She seems well." Harriet had said, "She is. She has built something real." He had said, "So have we." She had turned from the window and looked at him, and in the lamplight of their kitchen with the fire burning and the house quiet around them she looked exactly herself, completely and recognizably Harriet, the woman he had followed across a street in redemption because he needed to know her name and had spent every day since finding more of the answer. She had said, "Yes, Abel, we have." She had come to where he was sitting, and he had put his arm around her waist, and she had rested her hand on his shoulder, and they had stood together in the kitchen of the store they had run for 15 years in the town they had chosen, and the story that had begun with dust and smoke and a question asked across a violent street had settled into this, into the deep and living quiet of a life fully inhabited. A life with room in it for grief and work and children and argument and laughter, and the particular unspeakable grace of being entirely known by another person and loved without reservation anyway. Outside, New Mexico territory was entering a new century that would change everything. Inside, the fire burned, and the house held its warmth, and Harriet Baker McCrae and Abel McCrae remained exactly where they were together, as they had been and would be, and that was, in every way that mattered, entirely enough.